So yeah, thanks for having me, Justin and Kyle. Really excited to chat about my favorite topic in the world, as lame as it might be, podcast marketing. Actually, it's not that lame. People always, so a little background on me. I used to run a podcast production agency starting in 2015, did that. I have one client left who is so low maintenance that we just keep going on. Although I've largely moved on from that business and am now kind of over the past 4 years have focused basically 100% on the podcast marketing side of things. And so I kind of made that transition. I am not a marketer as by trade. I am a creator. My early kind of creative endeavors were in poetry and songwriting and music, specifically like heavy metal and hardcore music, which is like selling out and marketing are kind of antithetical to the whole scene. So I came from the far marketing skepticism is probably too soft a word, like marketing hatred almost side of things, and have now realized that for me at least, and I think for a lot of creators like who don't like marketing, to me marketing is actually the most creative thing I can think of, because I get to write, I get to make video, I get to make audio, I get to design things. I actually get to use the whole palette of creative toolkits and skills to be able to figure out how do I communicate with people and make cool stuff. And so one of the things that has been so like mind-blowing for me, not everybody has a background in poetry or songwriting or anything like that, but I actually find copywriting to be the exact same skill set, where you're trying to say as much as possible in as few words as possible and as artfully as possible, and move people and change their emotional state and all these things. So I think we can, for anybody who like doesn't like the idea of marketing, I always like to start there, is that there's actually this reframe where marketing can be this really creative source of expression. And it's actually, we often think about like doing marketing to our podcast, and ideally our marketing should be an extension of the thing that we're already doing, the podcast, the product, newsletter writing, whatever that might be, videos. So that's the place that I like to start. And so I've been focused 100% on podcast marketing over the past number of years. And that really emerged out of a lot of the clients in my agency, coming to me asking, how do I grow my podcast? And me being like, I have no idea. And if I don't figure this out, I'm going to lose my clients. So I better figure this out. And so I have done a bunch of research, and that's just kind of been a continual process, as well as a lot of experimentation that has led to everything that I have come to learn about podcast marketing. And so one of those core pieces, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to jump into the presentation here, has been, let's see, get my right screen up here. Okay, desktop 2. Everybody should be able to see this, I believe. This is the wrong screen. Let's try that again. There we go. All right. So one of the core things here that I have learned about podcast marketing is that there are distinct phases when it comes to the activities that we should be doing and that are going to get us results. And so that's what we're going to be really talking about here today, is kind of maximizing your growth by using the right strategy at the right time. So probably if you've done any research in podcast marketing, you've come across some things like promo swaps and social media and podcast guesting, SEO, paid advertising, newsletters, YouTube, feed drops, joining a network, live events, TikTok, in-person networking, cold email, brand partnerships, private communities, and maybe even Super Bowl ads. I don't know if I've seen a Super Bowl ad for a podcast yet. I have seen Times Square ads for podcasts. So that is certainly, this might be the last kind of like barrier to breach in podcasting, is the Super Bowl ad. Surely sooner or later it's going to happen. And so the reality is a lot of times we're looking for ways to grow our podcast, and we think we're looking at tactics specifically. And a lot of times it might feel like there's actually a shortage of things that work. The reality is there are actually, a lot of ways that we can grow our podcast. There are a lot of tactics out there, a lot of strategies that do work to grow podcasts. And so the problem is not a shortage of tactics, but the biggest reason in my experience that shows fail to grow is because their marketing isn't aligned with their current phase of growth. And so usually what this looks like is we see marketing by big shows, and we as a small show think, oh, they're doing that, they're successful, ergo I need to do that as well, and that's going to work for me. And the reality is that is generally not the case. And so what we don't realize is the show, to get to that level, they did a bunch of stuff maybe 5 years ago that was not visible to us, that actually allowed them to level up. And so now we're looking at what they're doing with 10,000 downloads an episode or 100,000 downloads an episode, and marketing at that stage is drastically different than what you're doing when you're first trying to start out. And so the 4 phases of growth, as I break them down, the first one is this kind of 0 to 100 downloads an episode, which is this validation stage. Stage 2 is where you're looking at gaining. Now you have traction and you're looking to start scaling up a little bit. So that's in the 100 to 1,000 downloads an episode range. Phase 3 here is when you're like really actively scaling. You have something solid that you know is resonant with people. And so that's going from, 1K to 10K. And then everything after that is this kind of diversification stage. And these are, broad numbers. They don't equally apply 100% to every show. And so the numbers might change, but the stages, the phases are the same for every show. And it's just that some shows might have a cap at a lower number or a higher number, depending on what that show is. And there are certainly shows with a very small number of downloads that are highly profitable, very successful shows, but they're just serving a very niche audience. And maybe the whole point is to attract high ticket clients or something like that. And so you need 100 downloads an episode, and that can, really power the business. And other shows actually demand you need 25,000 downloads an episode to make any profit at all. And so there's a lot of kind of the business model plays into this significantly as well in terms of what your show needs to be in order to be, quote unquote, successful. And obviously each of us determines that for ourselves. So one of the things that the key points to think about with these 4 phases here is that there's a continuum here, a spectrum of marketing that goes from non-scalable to scalable. And so when we're thinking about shows at the early stage, this is actually going to be less scalable marketing. And so we're actually relying less on things. A lot of times people want to jump to advertising or even social media to some extent, but looking at these ways to get in front of a lot of people all at once, when actually that is rarely the thing that's going to get us to that next stage of traction, of phase 2, where we're then scaling up from there. But conversely, the bigger the show is, the more scalable our marketing is going to be. And so this is something that is an important thing to kind of understand. Of like, when we're first starting out, we are looking to make one-to-one connections with our audience members, and that might be in person, that might be through social media, but probably not by posting content, but by reaching out, connecting one-on-one with people, commenting on other people's content, and making more genuine connections with people who we feel may be a good fit for our show. So if we start off here, we've got those 4 phases. So if you just want to drop in the chat which phase everybody is in here, that would be helpful for me to know. So we got phase 1 is 0 to 100. Phase 2 is 100 to 1,000 downloads an episode. Phase 3, 1,000 to 10,000. And then phase 4 is anything above 10,000. So Justin's phase 2. And we'll see what else we got. Validation we got there as well. 2 or 3. Phase 1, 1. 1 teetering to 2. All right, so we got people in kind of, across the first 3 phases. That's probably pretty common. Most shows are going to be in either phase 1 or 2, and we're going to get maybe a little bit more granular. Like I said, there's some nuance here in terms of download numbers. They don't always, 100% align, but I think as we get into these, you'll be able to get a better sense of what you should be doing right now and what some of the challenges might be. And we're going to go through this pretty quickly. There is a larger mega guide that I can link to if you want to go way more in depth on this afterwards. And so you can find that afterwards as well. So let's start off with phase 1. And really, at its core, phase 1 is all about validating the idea behind your show. And so a lot of times we jump into producing the deliverable, the podcast, and we think that that's the thing that people are going to want. And, ultimately, that's the thing that people are going to interact with, they're going to listen to. But the more important thing that I think we often ignore is, what is the big idea behind the show that the show is built on? And the show is a way to communicate that idea. And if the idea doesn't have traction, if it isn't resonant with people, no matter what we do with the show, we're not going to have any success. And so a lot of times we think about, okay, what is my format? Am I doing interview or solo show? What kind of technical gear am I using? And we don't really think about, or we have an underdeveloped idea. There's an idea that there's a good seed of an idea there, but we haven't really developed that fully and tested, is this something that has potential to grow beyond, my friends and family or immediate network? And so some of the challenges, and really there's one big challenge in phase 1 here, is establishing what I think of as podcast market creator fit. And so there's kind of 3 pieces to this where we're trying to establish, okay, does our show land and connect with the market? And so our potential audience, the ideal listeners here, is there an appetite that is existing? We're never going to be able to create demand or interest in a topic. It's the best we can do is tap into something that already exists. And so people are interested in something, they're looking for a solution to something. And so we want to align our show as a novel way, an original way to, address that existing interest. And so if that doesn't exist, the show cannot be successful no matter what we do. And then there's also the market and creator fit side of things, where it's like, we ideally want to spend time with the people that our show is attracting. And so you do get this where some shows, you'll create a show and you attract all these people who you just hate spending time with. And like, that's not something that's sustainable in the long term. So we want to make sure there's fit there as well. And then the last one is that the show and creator fit. And so the podcast creator fit here is about, is this a show that you enjoy doing, that you feel is sustainable? And there are certainly shows where it might be, you might be able to build an audience, there's fit with the market, but it takes you 25 hours a week to produce, and it's just totally unsustainable, and you don't have that bandwidth. And so that's not something that is really feasible in the long term. And so thinking about this, is there demand? Is my core idea resonant? When I tell people not about the show, but about I'm thinking about creating a podcast about this, and here's what it would do. And so you can start this well before you even record any bit of audio and testing out, like, are people interested in the idea? And then if they are, then how do I construct my show to best deliver that idea in an interesting way? Also thinking about, can I find and access potential listeners efficiently? There are some shows where you have a clear target audience, but you have no way to get in touch with them. And so it would be easy to say, well, I want to create a show that is for billionaires and it's going to help them achieve XYZ. But how do you actually market to those people? How do you market to billionaires? You have no probably direct connection to those people. So you can create a show and hope they find it. I don't know that many billionaires are doing like SEO keyword searches for, some topic and you're going to come up there. Probably they're being recommended shows by their existing network. And if you're not a part of that network, don't have any access to it, you're not going to have much success. And so this exists, that's a kind of extreme example, but this does exist across very many topics where if you don't have a way to actually get in touch of people and communicate one-to-one with potential listeners, it's going to be very, very difficult to ever attract that audience. We can also think about, is the pitch landing here? And so how do you talk about the show in a way that gets people to understand what it's about, gets them excited about it? And then, is this something that you want to commit several years or more of your life to this? And if it's not, then it probably is best to look for another idea that you're more excited about. And I think a lot of times when I talk about this, people are like, oh, is it really going to take that long? And it's kind of like, well, that's kind of the point, right? Like if it's successful, the goal is to keep doing this forever or as long until we lose interest in this. And so it should be something that you want to keep doing regardless of the audience. And that if this was to go for 10 or 15 years, you'd be like, yeah, I'm at this point, maybe my taste is going to change over time. But at this point, I'm really excited to do this as long as I possibly can, because this is my art and my craft. And it also serves potentially my business or some other aspect of my life. So in phase one, a couple of things to focus on in this early stage of marketing. And a lot of this stuff is not actually going to feel like what we oftentimes think of as marketing. And so the first one is to accept that you probably know nothing about your show or the best way to deliver it or anything about your audience. And we have some assumptions, we have some hypotheses, but really the focus in phase one is saying, okay, I've got some assumptions. My job is to test this by talking to people. And so the way we do that is by embedding ourselves in a community of the people that you want to attract. And then while we're there, rack up as many interactions and conversations. These can be Zoom calls, these can be comment and DM exchanges in the community. This can be on Twitter or LinkedIn in the comment sections of other people's audiences. And so if you know somebody who has a big audience and they're starting conversations on a topic that is related to yours, just showing up and being an active participant in their community first before trying to create your own. And so what we're really trying to do here is really get an understanding of our audience in a much more nuanced way than we might already have. Depending on who you are and what your show is about, maybe you've already accumulated this over your existing career. And so you might have this, but you might not have had specific conversations about your kind of content and your idea. So what we're looking to do here is just embed ourselves, integrate ourselves into a community so that we really understand it. And one of the core things here is listening to all the other podcasts on your topic. And this is a really confronting task because we all feel that kind of imposter syndrome. We think that everybody else's show is better than ours, and we feel immediately bad when we start listening to other shows, especially bigger ones. But there's ultimately no way to differentiate our show if we don't know what we're trying to differentiate ourselves from. And what we're really looking to do here is come up with a show that either sometimes it's like contradictory to other shows. There might be shows that say this is the way to do it, and we're saying, actually, I don't think that's right. I think people really should be approaching this topic this way. Or it could be complementary. And so it could be saying, oh, I really like this show. This is a great show, but it doesn't really talk about this thing. So I'm going to offer a show that does, it's aligned kind of intellectually or philosophically with this other show, but we're going to focus on this different aspect of it. And so it's not always competitive. A lot of times it is complementary to the other shows, but we need to know what they're already doing if we're going to create something that people have a obvious reason to choose ours over any other show or in accompaniment to any other shows. And then the last thing here is we're looking to constantly iterate on the show concept and delivery until we're getting rave reviews from existing and potential listeners. And so in this phase one here, it's not really about going all out with our promotion. It's about one-to-one connection with people and really testing our pitch, gauging people's reaction, testing out different show formats, different content topics. And we're really trying to just narrow in on like what clicks with people, what clicks with us and what clicks with our audience. And the stage, one of the things that you'll find when you know you're on the right track in phase 1 and 2 is when your downloads are still going to be low, but you're getting comments from people where they're saying like, man, how don't more people know about this show? And especially if you talk about your downloads and you see people saying like, I don't get it. Like, this is the best show on the topic. This is my favorite show. This is my must listen every week. Until you're getting that type of feedback from people, that's a sign that, okay, there's more iterating to do and I'm not quite hitting the mark. And the reality is that, especially, I mean, at every stage of podcast growth, word of mouth is such a huge part of it. And it's typically in a lot of surveys that they've done about how people find podcasts, it is the either number one or number two way that podcasts are discovered. And so obviously to get people talking about it, we need to create a show that is worth talking about, that, means a lot to them on an emotional and or, intellectual or just utility kind of usefulness way. And so that's what we're aiming for in the early stages, is kind of really dialing in, how can I create a show that gets that type of response from a small number of people? And if we can do that for 20 people, then those people are going to talk about it more, and we also know that we have something that is going to be worth promoting more broadly. So phase one is where a lot of people get stuck, and it's because they're trying to put the cart before the horse by marketing a show that is inherently unmarketable, so to speak. So moving on to phase two, once we have that idea has been validated, phase two requires us to start mastering the execution. And so some of the challenges in phase two is that your show idea has been validated. You've got a really solid idea here. Probably it's far from perfect though. And so this is going to be something that we need to now work on a lot of the mechanics of the show. And so this is going to be starting to improve some of the show mechanics, like how you craft your hooks for opening episodes and structure your interviews and all these types of things that make up the actual deliverable. And then we also want to start expanding and experimenting with more scalable marketing tactics. And so some of these we'll talk about in a second here of what those might be. So some of your focus in phase two is going to be continue to iterate on and tighten up the show concept. Probably it's still, far from perfect. We've got a kind of base level, something that we validated, but we want to tighten that up further. We want to focus on, like I said, the episode mechanics, thinking about format, messaging, especially your one sentence pitch. And so that's going to be just a continual process throughout the life of your show, thinking about how do I talk about this in a way that is succinct and gets people to understand why it's relevant to them and what's interesting about it. And this is one of the most maddening parts of marketing, is getting the right words to describe this thing that you do that takes place over potentially hundreds of episodes. Like, how do I boil that down to 10 words in a way that gets people's eyes to light up? And so this is where we're going to start focusing on that pretty heavily. We also want to improve the craft of podcasting. So interviewing, storytelling, hooks, idea development, editing, all these things that are going to become necessary if we have larger growth aspirations. And then thinking about looking for one and just one more scalable marketing channel. And so this is typically going to be collaborations or podcast guesting are some of the best ways to do this. Social media is in general a terrible way to get actual podcast listeners. It's useful for growing the brand, for growing awareness of the podcast, but it is a way to waste a lot of time if you are hoping to actually get listens. And so there's utility in growing the brand, just so there's a reason to do it. And I generally approach social media with more of a connection focus. And so I'm looking to make connections with potential collaborators that then we can collaborate with our podcasts. And that's going to be the thing that drives actual listener growth. And even those, you need to do a bunch of them. So I usually look for one thing that is proven to work, do some experimentations, find, okay, I did a podcast guesting. I guested on another episode of another show. That worked. I brought in 50 new listeners. Okay, that works. I'm just going to do only that. That is my one marketing activity, is guesting on other shows. And the more you do it, the more of a system you build up over it. And once that gets to become kind of rote, then you can expand into something else. But most shows do not need 10 different marketing channels to get people back to them. They need one thing that works that they can be consistent with. And so that's what we're looking to develop in this stage here. So into phase three here. By phase three, you've got a promising show. You're over 1,000 downloads an episode. That is way more than most shows ever get to. And so we've got something here that is workable. And now, and only now at this point, is it really time to start ramping up the marketing side. And so again, a lot of people in phase 1 and 2 think they have a marketing problem. Usually it's actually a show problem or a messaging problem or a podcast packaging problem in terms of cover art and description and the first impression that people get when they come across it. So some of the challenges in phase three are a lot of times you begin to tap out existing marketing channels. And so maybe you've already guested on all the shows in your space. And so now you need to expand to find, okay, what is the next thing that I can do to reach new listeners? The second thing here is you need to start refining your content to world-class levels. And this depends a lot on your goals. And so if you're looking to reach that, 10,000 and beyond download an episode, competition just gets more fierce. Shows that have that number of downloads are going to be better produced, have better guests. Like everything is just going to be more competitive. And so, if that is the goal of your show, you need to accept that, okay, well, I need to create a show that is worth that amount of downloads and comparable to other shows that are of that size. And so, we need to, just constantly be focusing on developing the craft further. Thinking about sustainable monetization strategies at this point become much more realistic, and so that's often a blend of sponsorships or brand deals, as well as your own product or service sales. Potentially, some people I know do quite well with affiliates, and there's other things in there as well. But thinking about at this point, probably you have something that is definitely monetizable, and thinking about how can you start to set up those opportunities, and so that those can feed back into the growth of the show, that you can invest more into it. And then this is, I think, the big challenge at this point is now you start to need to balance both producing a better show, because now if we're aiming higher, we still need to produce a better show than we probably currently are, while also spending more time marketing. And so this is, I think, at phase three, this is the squeeze here, where it's like both we need to do more marketing and we need to make a better show, and we might not have the income from the show yet, or perhaps from outside of that, to be able to make those adjustments. And so this is, I think, where a lot of people run into this conundrum where it's like, well, I can either spend my time marketing or doing the show. I mean, this is a thing that everybody runs into at every stage, but here it becomes a real inhibitor to growth. So the focus in phase three, when you're thinking about your marketing, is experimenting with and optimizing for more scalable marketing channels. And so maybe you've done collaborations or podcast guesting, and now you might be looking to add more to this. Maybe it's looking into how to better use social media to grow the brand as a whole and grow your larger content ecosystem. It's going to be, like I mentioned, shifting that balance of time that you invest in your show further to the marketing side of things. And when I say that, it's like what we traditionally think of as marketing, or more promotion, which is kind of the last stage of marketing. And it's really developing the actual show is the foundation of any successful marketing, which is where the first stages are going to be at. But now we need to ramp up the other side of things. The promotion, the exposure at this stage become much more important. Building out the larger marketing machine. And so specifically here, email marketing is the big one for me. You might also look at expanding into additional formats like YouTube if you haven't already, or thinking about how do we, use TikTok to repurpose clips or things like that in a more intentional way, rather than just a kind of haphazard posting everywhere way. And so this is going to be a part of the focus in phase three as well, is really like focusing, emphasizing what we traditionally think of as the marketing and promotion of our show. All right, and the final stage here, phase four, diversification. And so the reality is that every show has a cap that it will not grow beyond. Every show eventually, and this is true for every business, everything follows what's typically called the S curve. And so you start off, if things are pretty slow, then it'll ramp up, and then eventually it tails off, where there's just, you've saturated the market, there's no more growth to be had. And this is the reality for many big shows. They're not actually growing that fast. They might be huge, but they're not really gaining new listeners anymore, because everybody knows about it already, and everybody who would listen to it has already given it a shot and made a decision about whether or not it's for them. So that bar is different for every show. Some shows that's 1,000 people. You'll never grow more than 1,000 people. Other shows that might be 100,000 people or 1,000,000, and it's just at some point you need to expect that will happen. And so when you do, is going to be in this phase four, and there's some things that we want to think about here. So once we get to that phase, what we're really looking at here is capitalizing on what you built and diversifying to potentially expand into additional audiences in other ways. So some of the phase four challenges here are, you're going to hit your show's natural peak at some point. And that's going to be largely due to increased competition, where now you're competing with just world-class content. And can you, meet that level in order to grow further? And if you don't have the resources or the team or whatever it is, it might be hard. And you might say, okay, well, this is as good a show as I can create for now, and this is probably as big as I'm going to get unless I bring in a larger team, more income, or whatever it is to scale further. And then there's also market saturation, like I mentioned, where everybody already knows about the show. And so these are kind of the two driving challenges here in phase four that either need to be worked with or overcome. So when it comes to the focus here, what we're looking at is kind of squeezing as much growth as you can from your existing show. And so that's going to be continuing to build a reliable system for creating world-class content. And so that's going to be, world-class ideas, world-class guests, world-class framing of those ideas, and in an interesting way. execution, production, all those things become really important at this stage, much more so than at the early stages, because it kind of the stage you're at demands it, especially if you want to keep growing. Also, maximally focusing on maximally scalable marketing tactics. And so this is the only stage where anybody should even consider paid ads or anything like that to grow your podcast, is when you're already tens of thousands of downloads. And this is one of the only ways to get in front of more new people. Ads are not an effective growth strategy in general for podcasting. Usually they're only used when you've promised a sponsor a certain amount of impressions, you're falling short, and then that's when networks will use paid ad services to make up those impressions. Also looking at, continual collaborations, things like that. I've talked to a lot of shows that do tens of thousands of downloads an episode, and they are just constantly, like, they will do cross promotions in every single episode ever. And a lot of times they'll be running 3 episodes a week, and they'll have a cross promotion for a different show in every single episode. And it becomes easier to do that when you have a bigger show, because you have more leverage to promote other shows. And so it's not always possible at the small stage. But at that point, you have to really build a system around continuing to set those up. And so, hopefully at this stage, your show, if you have tens of thousands of downloads, is producing income. You can spend more time on it, more resources. You have a bigger team. And so managing all that becomes, in one way, easier. But I like to point that out, because you shouldn't expect yourself to be able to do that if you're a solo creator early on and doing everything that the big shows are doing. And you don't necessarily need to either at that stage. The third thing here, or the second big thing, is diversifying your brand. And so thinking about alternative formats, platforms, launching new shows. You see a lot of shows that will reach a peak, like we think about This American Life, then they launch Serial as this thing that is related to, it's on the same brand, it's a totally different topic, but it's this offshoot. And so a lot of shows will do this, where they reach a cap on the one show, and then they launch a second show they start to build out their own internal network, because, okay, if we can't get more downloads and impressions with this show, let's launch something else that people will be interested in as well. And then the last thing is capitalizing on the asset that you've created. And so finding ways to monetize that and, pay off the hard work that you've put in, probably over several years at this point. So every show goes through each of these phases. A lot of times it happens behind closed doors, with, like, networks don't validate and test their shows in public. They do that in the year or two leading up to a show launching. So they've already done focus groups and talking with ideal listeners and all that kind of stuff behind closed doors. A lot of solo creators will do that in public. That is fine as well. But there's no jumping the queue here. Every show needs to go through these. And so the fastest way to optimize your growth, or the fastest path to growth, is to optimize for the stage that you're at and not try to jump ahead. And so that is the brief overview of these 4 phases of podcast growth. If you want to connect further, I put together a page at podcastmarketingacademy.com/SimplePod, and I've got a free marketing audit there. You can also find my newsletter, Scrappy Podcasting, which I send out every weekday, a short 2-minute unconventional podcast marketing or growth idea every day. And then there's some more resources there as well. So, okay, that was a bit of a whirlwind here, but would love to get into questions and follow-ups on everything that we talked about there.
Nice. Let's give Jeremy some snaps, or put an emoji out there too. Jeremy, you did a great job, and I really like this concept, and allows us to kind of chunk our efforts into these certain phases, which I really appreciate. And I'll plug his newsletter. I follow his newsletter. I really enjoy it. You give a lot of scrappy marketing advice in that newsletter, and I appreciate that. I get a lot of good thoughts from it. We had one question on downloads, and I think some people offered that most people look at their downloads via their podcast host. But Jeremy, any other tools, resources that you like in terms of just understanding the size and the phase that a show is in?
Yeah, I mean, I usually go through the host as well. The other one, what is it? OPP. Is this it? There's this open, I think the Open Podcast Prefix project. You can set your show up here. This is so I don't even know what my link is, but if you're interested, you can set your show up so that your downloads are publicly available, which most people don't want to do. But I think there's lots of reason to do it from a larger podcasting community standpoint, where it's just helpful to be able to know how other shows are doing and realize that most shows are not doing a crazy amount of downloads, even though we often think they are. And I think that it's also useful. They kind of like have a different way of measuring downloads. So they also have some additional and you can set your show up here and you don't have to share that link publicly as well. But they offer some different analytics in terms of like unique listeners and things like that that your podcast hosting platform might not offer you. And so that can be really helpful. And you can see like downloads versus unique listeners, and you can kind of say, okay, well, that means every listener on average listen to 1.3 episodes, which is pretty common. There's many flaws with all kinds of podcast measurement, so I don't take it as like gospel, whatever that will tell you, or your podcast host. But I use that. I also really like Chartable. If you're looking for a paid analytics resource, the great thing about Chartable, really the only tool, well, there's a great tool for collaboration and tracking how many, if you do cross promos or feed drops, things like that, and to be able to track how many people came through from that collaboration. They have a great tool for that. But the other thing that they have is this retention, cross episode retention graph. And so you can see people who listen to one episode, what percentage of those people listen to a subsequent episode. And it's a depressing graph, but I think it's useful to be realistic. And you can also measure it by month. And so you can see the drop off from month to month. And from my experience, not many people use it because it's a paid tool. But from what I've been able to gather, like if you get 50% of people who come back after the first episode that they listen to, like that is phenomenal. And often I've seen anywhere from like 20 to 50% is somewhat common. But to me, again, I think that this is useful data to, like, it's humbling, but it's also like, oh man, if only 25% of people are coming back after the first episode, like I need to up my game. Like the fastest way to grow is not getting more exposure. It's retaining more of the people who already, like the hardest part is winning over somebody to get their first play of the episode. So you've done like so much of the work just by convincing somebody to click play. And if you're not then getting them to come back, like that's the easiest way to actually grow, is by retaining more of those people who you've already done the heavy lifting for. They click play on an episode. How do we like keep them listening through the first episode and beyond? And so that comes down to making, better content. And there's many ways we could talk about that. But that's that to me is like the biggest win for a lot of shows.
Yeah, you said every listener on average listens to 1.3 episodes. Is that
I
what
think
I
that's
heard
what my
right?
show is something
Wow.
like that. And so yeah, there'll be people who listen to every episode. I did a survey for my show. What I did was I set it up for newsletter readers. So I have a newsletter about podcast marketing. I have a podcast about podcast marketing, and the newsletter has 9,000 readers. The podcast gets 100 or 50, or no, maybe it's 300 downloads an episode, something like that. And so I was like, okay, that is a small single digit percentage of people. Both these groups are both interested in podcast marketing. Why are so few people who subscribe to the newsletter listening to the podcast? And so I did a survey of my newsletter and just asked people, why do or don't you listen to the podcast? And, did you even know it exists? A lot of people don't know it even exists, even though I talk about it twice a week and dedicated emails to it. And then the other thing that I realized in doing the survey is like, it is a less than 10% of people listen to every episode, or
Mhm.
most every episode. And then there's a big percentage of people who listen to occasional episodes. So maybe, 1 out of 4. And then there's another large chunk of people who listen to one episode, decided it wasn't for them, or it's like, oh yeah, it was good, but I just have a queue full of other things. And
Yeah.
so to me, like, this is also helpful in understanding that a lot of times if we get 300 downloads an episode, we think it's 300 people who listen to every episode, but probably it's like 30 people who listen to every episode, and then a bunch of other people who are sampling in and out. That's constantly churning. They're different people every time. And so that actually, there's a lot of through flow that if we can capture and convert more of those people into every episode listeners, where the show is going to grow because we have a larger kind of foundation. So yeah, there's lots we could get into there as well.
Well, let's get into it. Open up for questions. If you would like to be a part of the conversation, feel free to hop off video at this point in time. I'll assume that if you're both muted and off video, to leave you alone and not call on you. But would love to kick off and start with questions. Anybody want to jump off of mute and start the conversation?
I'll start this. Jeremy, in phase 2 or 3, you mentioned email marketing as like an integral part of your podcast growth strategy. And it sounds like you've been talking about engaging your audience in the survey and using it for different applications like that. High level, just real quick, is there any like really feasible way that you see podcasters integrate the two together?
Yeah, I'm gonna so I just released a kind of collection of courses on this that I put into the chat, but I'm not plugging the courses. There's actually just an overview of the way I think about email with podcasting on that page. And so it's like a 20-minute video that you can kind of watch through my system for how I've set up and the ideal system, I think, for podcast and core or email integration, and then also thinking about products. And so that's a good overview there. I think I also, on my YouTube channel, I also have a video where I broke down some email stuff as well. So there's some stuff there too. But the high level for me are like, show of hands here, are people business owners? Like, you have a product or service that you're selling, or okay, so that's if that's where most people are. What I would say is, like, in order to get sales, like, email is non-negotiable. Like, podcasting is really great for accelerating trust and building rapport with people, but it's like you can get them to like the 90-yard line or the 95-yard line with the podcast, but it's so hard to get people to take action out of that because people are busy doing other things. It's just like the platform has its own constraints. And so email is great to be able to send a link to people. Like, you talk about something on a podcast, and then email, you send a link to your course or your services or whatever, and they can just click that. And they also have, there's this idea called platform psychology, where people expect to take certain actions in certain contexts. And so people are not trained to buy things from podcasts. That's not what they go into podcasting to do. They don't expect that, and so they don't do it. Whereas everybody buys stuff from their inbox all the time. And so we're kind of trained to, like, oh, I might actually actively sign up for things to get reminded when something's on sale in my inbox. So this is a sales channel. And so this is where I think about, like, the email. If podcasting is your main content channel, it's like, maybe that's your best content. The bar for your email strategy is pretty low. It's like, we just need to give something somewhat regularly that is like, people are just a little bit, if we've got this range of like, I'm glad I got this, to I'm annoyed that I got this, we need to be like 51% on the, like, oh, this was like, I'm just like a little glad I got this. And it's like, if we can meet that bar, then people will stay subscribed. And then when we have something, a promotion or something like that, they're going to open our email and take that action. And then for the non-business owners, like, email is also increases your value to sponsors, as well as the same dynamic plays out for sponsors, where it's like, now you've been getting an ad for 4 weeks, and then an email comes, hey, I want to tell you about this product. If you've been listening to the podcast, you might have heard about this. Here's a link to get a 50% discount code or 10% or whatever it is. And like, the sponsor is going to get more traffic because they got a direct email to the list, and you're going to be able to charge more for your sponsorships and all these things as well. So email, yeah, I think a lot of times we think like, oh, we need to put just as much effort into email as the podcast. If the podcast is great, the bar for email is much lower. I think is like the minimum viable value that you need to deliver. It's just like, just enough to keep people like happily opening your emails, which doesn't mean blowing their mind with your writing each and every time. So that would be how I would kind of think about those two components.
Gabby, do you want to expand on your comment? I liked that thought that you had in the chat.
Yeah, so I've been doing podcasting for 3 years. The first 2 years was like establishing rapport with my audience, making them know, like, and trust me, like, again, having them show up. Like, a lot of them are like, oh, it's like I'm having like a FaceTime with my girlfriend every week. Cool. So then what I had found was a bottleneck of, like, people saw me in this like light of, again, my podcast is Corporate Quitter. So like, they knew I was knowledgeable about it, but they couldn't actually tangibly see that I understood what the fuck I was talking about. So like, then the newsletter reinforced it. And so it's almost like taking a mini course every week. And I think that's partly because people were like, they've been craving physical stuff, tangible stuff to work with, but I didn't know how to translate my knowledge. Now I do. So the newsletter, I wouldn't say it's infancy. We're only, I think, 8 months. It'll be a year in November. So I'm still working through it. But either way, it's definitely helped, where people are like, oh my God, you know so much. I knew that you knew a lot, but hearing you and actually seeing it, your psychological response is different. Like, hearing one thing, like, you can only retain some of it. But when you actually read something, you digest it better. So it's just been able to, and now I'm getting to the point where I'm actually creating those newsletters into digital products, which now makes the monetization model like 10 times better. So it's like a nice little feed. I don't know if that answers your question. I can keep going on about it, but that's, I have found, even from sponsors, they love the omni-channel marketing approach. So the newsletter has been phenomenal, a great resource in my tool belt.
I like that thought.
Awesome. Yeah.
Jeremy, you got
yeah,
I was about to say.
Yeah. So, well, and I posted the YouTube video I mentioned in the chat there on newsletter stuff as well. So Mary's question here about when it's time to focus on one marketing channel, what do you think is the best? To me, it's either, it depends a little bit on your show framing, but either like cross promotions. And so you record an ad for another show and they do the same for you. And you can do that as a one-off or a recurring thing. And a lot of times I will do a one-off with a bunch of people and try to find something that works really well. And then that's a signal like, oh, okay, our audiences are aligned. Let's try and do more stuff together. And like when you find something that works, like do more of it rather than just say, okay, that worked. Like who next? Because now you got to go like reach out to somebody new, do the pitch, whatever. The great thing about collaborations is that they really in podcasting is that they, if you're targeting the right people, it's a really easy pitch because the value is so obvious to both people. And so that's where I would start. And you're gonna start with people, you know, if you have a small show, you don't have a lot of leverage to like, you know, go after big shows and do collaborations. So it's kind of like staircasing up and saying like, okay, if I'm at 200 downloads an episode, we're going to be looking at people with 100 to 300 or 100 to 500 downloads an episode. And the thing you find too is people generally, like everybody knows, everybody who produces a podcast knows how hard it is to grow. And so everybody's looking for opportunities. And if you're really well aligned, people don't really care that much what the download differential is. And so it's kind of like looking to do a bunch of swaps at that stage. And then as you get bigger, you have more leverage so you can attract larger or collaborations. And the other thing I'll add to that, well, and actually the other thing I was going to say, collaborations, but then podcast guesting. The thing for podcast guesting is it works better if you have it generally works better for business owners or like teachers, where like you have something to offer specifically from a teaching or educational perspective. A lot of people who take a more uh, like entertainment style or investigative approach to a topic where they're not the experts, it's sometimes harder to frame that as why they'd be a great guest. And so it can be done, but it can be a little bit harder to pitch yourself as a guest if you don't have that clear, like, you know, here I have this really distinct, unique point of view on this topic that nobody else is talking about, and I can frame it really well. That can work really well. And I will say that has become like the distinctive point of view has become kind of a must-have for podcast guesting at this point, because there's just the word is out that it's a good tactic. And so most people are inundated with terrible generic pitches. And so if you can come in and say with one great episode topic, and so not say, here's 5 things we could talk about, it's saying, okay, I know you talk about this topic, but you know, one of the things that I've noticed in working in this field is that everybody approaches it like this, but in reality, it's better to approach it this way, and here's why. And so if you can give that succinct pitch in like 2 sentences and say like, if you're interested, like I think this would be a great topic for your audience, I'd love to share my experience with this. And so it's like, here's, you know, I've done all the work for you. You don't have to pick between a bunch of topics. It's like, here's why this is interesting. Here's the kind of unconventional angle here. Here's this topic. Is it a fit? And so with podcast guesting, that can work really well. And then the thing I would say for both of those, guesting and collaborations, is I would pick a very narrow niche and try to go on and collaborate with every show in that niche. And the reason is that like people will generally, they'll listen to a podcast guest or they'll hear a collaboration and they won't do anything about it immediately. They'll be like, oh, that sounded really interesting, I'll check that out later. And so if we then go to a totally different niche, that person, they're like, oh, that show sounded interesting, but I forgot about it or whatever, they never listen. Whereas if they listen to 5 different shows and they've heard your ads on all of them, or they've heard you guest on all of them, they're now like, whoa, this person is everywhere. They must really be onto something. And that is this, you reach this critical mass. And so I really think about it as these like narrow segments of like, how can you saturate each like narrow segment and try and collaborate with as many people in that as possible, and then expand outward. And that kind of improves the efficiency for every like 10 podcasts you guest on, you're going to get more people back than if you did 10 different niches and everybody only had one impression with you.
I think that totally makes sense. Guys, I do want to be cautious of time here. I know we got 4 more minutes. So I'll send out a recording. I'll send out the resources that were shared via chat. We'll have another meetup by the end of the year. I'm looking to get Adam from Podcast Business School on the show. I'm super stoked about that conversation, but that will probably be wedged in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I'm wide open after this meeting, so happy to stay on and keep the discussion going. Jeremy, I don't know if you got a hard stop at the top of the hour.
No, I can stay on for another 15 minutes or so.
Cool. Yeah. So if anybody else wants to keep the discussion going, I know there are a few other questions here in the chat that we haven't got to. Feel free. But if you got to jump for something else, I want to respect your time and don't feel bashful to hop off the recording.
See ya, everybody who has to jump off. I don't know, Mary, are you jumping off or are you staying on? I saw you had a follow-up question here.
Yeah, I can stay on for a few. Thanks so much.
Okay, so in terms of just clarification with the cross promotions and swaps, I would say cross promotions are like the large umbrella category, and swaps are the tactic within that. And so cross promotions could be swapping an ad, or it could be doing a whole feed drop where like an episode of yours plays on their feed and vice versa. It could be also, it could be much further where it's like maybe one of the things that I've done quite a bit is if you have a great lead magnet for your email list, it's like you're swapping those with your email lists or doing an ad for those on the podcast. So it's not even podcast related, but it's within the larger brand that you're both cross promoting. And so there's like the sky's the limit in terms of how you might collaborate together and do some kind of cross promotion. And even like, workshops like this is a great one for anybody who does like educational. What I found is a lot of times I've pitched myself as a podcast guest to a bigger show, and they've been like, we're already booked up through whenever. And then I've said, oh, well, okay, if it's helpful at all, like I know you have a membership community. If it's interesting for me to do like a workshop on, some kind of podcast marketing, it seems like that might be relevant. And a lot of times they'd be like, oh yeah, that would be awesome. And so you don't get in front of the big audience sometimes, but you get in front of a maybe higher value audience of paying customers. And that only works if okay, they have a membership. And, I know from running a membership that does guest expert workshops that it's like booking podcast guests. It's just this like task you have to do and you have to kind of keep on top of. And so if you have a great person who already has a great topic come to you and you're like, oh great, I just filled that slot for next month or whatever, and like now I don't have to think about it. So that's another way to pivot from one potential collaboration to say, oh, if that doesn't work, like if you're interested, if they show a signal like, oh, the podcast isn't a fit, but I really like your work, then I take that as license to say like, well, let me pitch something else. And if they turn that down too, I'm gonna drop it. But if they're like, oh, your work looks really cool, I'm like, okay, well, the podcast not a fit. Like, let's do a newsletter swap or whatever else.
Gotcha.
I like
that's
the
helpful.
creativity.
Very clear. Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Awesome.
a good idea on the pitching the mastermind or the membership group or something like that as well, because it doesn't seem like having both. I get tons of podcast guesting pitches all of the time. Very few times do I get someone that comes and wants to speak to the group and comes with a succinct idea like they do podcast guesting.
Yeah.
Jeremy, I really like the thought around the one sentence pitch on your show too, and with working with clients, I found that really helpful, but sometimes really challenging too. Any guidance on like both guiding myself and other people on how to really develop that one sentence pitch?
Yeah, let me I'll just share my template here, or the written out versions of it. Let's see. Where do I have it here? So there's kind of there are three versions of really one central one here. And if we pull this up here. Okay, so here's how I typically will go about it. Where'd the chat go? Just format these a little more nicely. Okay, so here in the chat, this is where I usually start with. And so there's a few ways you can think about it, but it's like so your show name is a podcast about whatever your topic is, where in every episode there's some verb subject to help you get some result. And so let me think of an example for mine. So mine for my podcast roast podcast, which is, people it will be a podcast eventually. Right now it's a YouTube show. So I think of it as a podcast because it kind of started as a podcast. Now it's not really even available in podcasting. We're going to run with it. So, and it also doesn't even have a name. So that's problematic as well right now. But it's nominally called Roast My Podcast. So Roast My Podcast is a podcast about podcast marketing, where in every episode we tear down a listener's podcast to help you improve your discoverability and listener acquisition. And so here we've got the show name, the topic, we tear down. And so we tear down a listener's podcast. And so now we have a very specific thing about the show that is also unique to help you get some result. And so I find that this pitch framework, and there's a few different variations of that. And so the second one I like as well, which leans more into the differentiation. So it's like a show is this show is a podcast about this topic. Unlike other shows about this topic, only we do this. And so the challenge here is like, it's a simple sentence to fill out, but it has to be true. And it also has to be true and interesting to people. And so you could have a show that's entirely different from other shows that isn't actually different in an interesting way. And so that's the challenge with this. And what I like about this is it's such a simple template that if you can't fill this out in a way that is both true and compelling, that's not a sign that you need to work on your pitch. It's a sign that you need to work on your show and say, oh, the show is not differentiated and in an interesting way. How do I actually change the show? And the nice thing too is that sometimes you get to the better show by using just different words. And you say, okay, what would make this sentence interesting? And if I can start with an interesting sentence, then can I say, well, can I make that show? And if the answer is yes, you're like, oh, great. Like this is, if you almost want to start with something that you can like pitch to people before you even start creating it. And so before I ever really start creating a new show, usually I just start with the pitch and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to start running this by people. And I might say, I have a show about this, or I'm thinking about doing a show like this. Here's the pitch. And I'm just looking for like, do they lean in? Are they like, oh, that sounds really interesting? And that's when like, okay, this is a show that has legs here. This is the kind of that phase one. And if we can get to that even before creating anything, you're like, okay, well now I've got a good idea. Let's go test that out and see how it works in practice. Can I actually execute on this well?
Yeah, and like true positive affirmation to that. Not like, oh yeah, that sounds like a good show. I'll check it out. But like, oh, that sounds good. What was that called again? And they're like actively
Where do I
opening
find
up their
that?
podcast player. Yeah. That's cool. I like that. Yeah, the first bullet I think is a really good one. I got to use that for kind of forcing thought into some of my clients.
Yeah. And yeah, to Mary's question here, I'll just share the most recent episode if you're interested in the podcast roasts.
Was this the one
Everybody
you were
tells us-
co-hosting with someone? I
Yeah.
listened to like the early episodes on the podcast player, and you took it off.
Well, so it started because I had it sprung out of, it kind of happened accidentally. So I did this big industry report on podcast marketing. So it's called Podcast Marketing Trends.
Yeah.
And I did that last year. The next year version will be coming out in a couple months. But then we did a podcast unpacking the data that we found about podcast marketing. And so the show is called Podcast Marketing Trends Explained. And so really that show is tied to the report. It's about unpacking the data and talking about what does this mean? How do you make use of this as a podcaster? And then we were going to just do, my co-host Justin and I, we had done these like podcast roasts on YouTube, like a YouTube live session in the past. And we were like, oh, that would be fun to like, as a way to just integrate this into the show to get listener engagement, things like that. And we thought naively, like we can do that in 5 minutes an episode. It'll be the segment at the end of the episode. And so we recorded the first one. And of course it's 45 minutes long. And we're like, well, that's its own show. And so we just started alternating and having those in that feed. But then once we reached the end of the season of the more data-driven show, is kind of like, well, this show really is tied to the report. It's not, it will become watered down and just become about these roasts. And so at that point we were like, okay, the roasts are their own show. Right now it's just on YouTube because there's more of a visual element of like examining the show artwork and things like that. And so it's kind of more to preserve the actual original show, which is going to have subsequent seasons that are going to be tied to the original concept. So I am setting up a feed. The bottleneck is that I have reached the limits of my design capability. So I've like the episodes loaded into a feed and it's all set up, but I have just a hideous artwork for it that I need to hire a designer for. And so that's the bottleneck right now in terms of it being a podcast.
That's fair. Sam chatted me something right before he left, and he said he's been watching these roasts for a while, and he said 10 out of 10 would recommend. And then he said, thank you, Jeremy and Justin. So I think he meant to send that to everybody, but he DM'd that to me. So it sounds like he was a fan.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Glad to hear it.
I do remember those episodes a little bit, and I did struggle because of the visual component. And you guys, so often you guys would talk about the what do you call it, the podcast package. So I had like found myself having to like flip over to that podcast while you guys were talking to it to surf through, which wasn't the worst thing, but just not something that you can always do if you're driving or, even walking or something when you don't really want to have your phone in your hand.
Yeah.
This has been so helpful. Thank you guys so much. I've been a reporter and senior producer for so long, but I've never been an EP. And so I got funding recently to do my own, and I was like feeling very overwhelmed. So now I feel like much more focused, and I feel like I can concentrate on a couple of key points marketing wise. So I really appreciated this, and thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is it Mary
awesome.
or Mary Rose? Do you go by just Mary?
Yeah, it's Mary Rose.
Oh, okay, got it. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully
I think my mom wanted me to become a nun, so it didn't happen. But it's okay. I'm still a good person. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll see you around. I'll send you an invite to next quarterly's meetup.
Okay. Thank you again.
See ya.
Okay. Bye.
Right. See ya.
Andrea, Kyle, anything else? Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. So I have been recording for a year. I have a ton of episodes. I'm now dripping them out, but I am a marketer myself, and I am marketing overload. And I feel like this is why podcasters end up quitting, because they hit burnout. So I'm wondering, where should I really focus in on, like, what marketing technique should I like solely focus in on just to start out to get my podcast out there?
Yeah. So for what's the topic of the show?
It's called Podium to Profit. So I help speakers make a shit ton of money on and off the stage.
Okay. So like I would start, I know there's lots of speaking podcasts out there. So I would think about like it clearly you have a opinion about it and a point of view and a track record. So I would like package that point of view as a pitch to get on other shows. That's
Okay.
probably going to be like I would almost only focus on that. Like maybe you're doing, like you might have some kind of social media that you're doing like in the background, but I would not put on too much pressure on that as a growth channel. I would just like, okay, I have low expectations about this. I'll show that I'm like active if people search me or go to my profile after getting me on a show. But like the main thing would be to guest on other shows is where my opinion would be. And so that your success there comes down to the pitch and like your point of view and like refining that into something that is distinctive and original and refreshing so that and well, so I guess there's two things here. There's a lot of shows about speaking, but you might be in competition with them. And so that might not actually be, if you have a very complimentary point of view to some of those shows, that would be a good thing to pursue. Otherwise, I would look at more entrepreneurial shows and business shows, and like that's where you're going. And you might even start off on narrower niches. And so what I always do is I look at my customer list and I look at there's this concept called jobs to be done. I don't know if anybody knows about this, but it's essentially that it was started off as this Harvard Business School study where essentially consumers hire products and service, or like products as much as people, to do a job for them. And the same is true for content as well. And so like people listen to a podcast because they want something out of it. It's going to do something for them. So it's useful to understand on the podcast front, but I always think about this with my customers as well. And I'll like look back and I'll say, okay, who are my top 10 all-time clients? And I'll look at like, okay, what brought them to me in the first place? What was the problem that they had that caused them to reach out? What was the work that we did together? So this is kind of like the thing that got them to reach out. That's the job they were looking to have done. The work we did together might be a different thing, and often is. And then like, what was the result that we got out of this? And maybe what was the result they were hoping for? And so I'll like just go through the list and you find out. And then I'll also have a column for like, how would I describe this person, or what is their job? And oftentimes you find it's not clear to you because you just work with people regularly. You don't really think about them that analytically. Oftentimes trends will emerge and say, like my service is for everybody, but for some reason, my best clients tend to be in the health and wellness space, and they're specifically nutrition coaches. And it's like, that's funny. I'm not like marketing to those people, but for some reason I have a lot of success with them. And so now that's the sign, like, okay, let me pitch nutrition podcasts for building a nutrition business or health coach podcasts. And like, that's where I'm going to go. Not because my product or service is particularly niche to them, but just something about me seems to resonate with those people. And like, that's where I'm going to start off. And so sometimes it might be that specific with a niche. Other times it might be related more to a specific problem. Okay. And that then gives you some insight into, well, this should probably be the pitch angle. If this is where I'm really having success, that is interesting to people, that they're like, oh, I couldn't find this anywhere else. And like, you really helped me do this thing. It's like, oh, well, that's it. Maybe it's not going to grow my audience maximally, but it's going to attract clients who are looking for that thing. And that's really what I'm after. So kind of mining some of that past data, looking for any kind of trends. I would, like start easy, go for like top 3, 5, 10 clients and just like do some research on that. And you can probably do it in like 30 minutes and just find out a few quick notes on those people. And hopefully that can kind of point you in the direction of what types of, where do I find more of these people, and look for those types of shows.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think more mine are professionals, and I've never seen anybody offer the services that I offer. I have to be that like, oh, I got to start my own trend. Thanks a lot, Andrea. Like, that's so helpful. So yeah, that's really helpful. So thank you so much.
And it's actually a great, it's kind of hard because there is some lead time sometimes before them actually taking the step, but it's also great. Like if you guest on other speaking podcasts, they're already, now you're competing with other sources of information about speaking. Whereas
Right.
if you go to these like professional shows or conferences or whatever, and you're the only person who's ever made this like really compelling case around how speaking would help their career, they're like, wow, Andrea's like the person. She's the only person I've ever heard talk about this. This is mind blowing. And you're like, yeah, there's lots of people who talk about speaking, but like you've
Yeah.
reached this audience who isn't aware of that. And so now you're kind of like the gold standard that they're going to compare everything else to.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful because mine is more in like the marketing space. So like their ecosystem. So it's like, okay, you have a talk, you've been talking, you've probably made 6 figures plus, you're on the
Mhm.
stage, but you have no idea how to market it
Yeah.
or
Yep.
sell from the stage. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Andrew,
All
anything
right.
else before we hop here?
No, I think that's it. That was really helpful because I don't want to be spinning my wheels. Like I'm doing blogging, social media, email marketing, like reaching out to my hosts, even thinking about like doing a giveaway. Like I'm like, girl, this is a lot.
Yeah.
That was my big takeaway too. It was like less, I was kind of coming in here and hoping to kind of figure out like what do I need to be doing. But instead, Jeremy, you kind of just like told me and made a list of like everything I just should stop doing or should not be focusing on right now,
Yeah.
which I thought was super helpful in that context.
Yeah, less is
Yeah.
more, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you can just get better at that one thing too, which is nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go pitch myself then.
All right.
Cool.
Love
See you,
to hear
Andrea.
that.
Thank you guys. Have a great day.
See ya.